Thanks very much for inviting me to this. It's very exciting to be here. So I am a senior economist at the Center for Economic Studies at the U.S. Census Bureau. I started in a previous division at the Census Bureau that has been kind of incorporated into the Center for Economic Studies called the Center for Administrative Records Research and Applications. And our role at the Census Bureau was to collect administrative records from other agencies, other state governments, some private data, commercial data, so on and so forth, with the goal of helping the Census Bureau in its mission to count the American people and also to say something about American economic the American economic situation and population situation. So that's kind of my background. I have worked at the Census Bureau since I got my PhD in 2012. And in this roadmap, I'm going to be crossing into a couple of categories, including open access and failure to replicate are a couple of those issues that I think this talk is going to fit into. So what I'm going to talk about here is I'm going to introduce administrative records. I have a specific definition that I'm going to be using for the duration of the talk because they're what I know and they're what I work with. And I'll be very specific about what those administrative records are. They're also the administrative records that you tend to see a lot in sort of the whiz-bang economic analysis that's coming out these days in the highest ranked journals like the QJE and the AAR. And so it's going to be very relevant for a lot of work that's being done today. And I'll go over the legal and bureaucratic barriers to accessing those data for the purposes of replicability of studies and the issues that creates around transparency and scientific merit. And so, yes, I'll talk about what the implications are for those, and then I'll talk about some current and what I'll call the ideal solution. We are very much aware of the fact that we're in a privileged position in terms of these data and that we should be opening up access to these data sets. After this talk, hopefully you'll come away with understanding why they're not accessible at the current moment, and then what are sort of the next best steps we are trying to take or proposing to take to make our work a little bit more transparent and the work of other people who use administrative records. Those three things are going to be the provision of syntax code, which we are only really just sort of talking about, the development and distribution of aggregate and synthetic data, which has a fairly long-standing history at the Census Bureau. And then, of course, the final and best solution would be that, there's a more open ability to get to the underlying microdata. Okay, so to set this up, I was doing some research on the topic to make sure that I knew exactly what it was I wanted to talk about. And I came across this blog post by a fellow who goes by the Grumpy Economist. He writes the famous quotation from Fermat about, "I have a truly marvelous demonstration of a given proposition, which this margin is too narrow to contain." And then it took mathematicians another 350 years to solve what he was talking about. And in a very comparable way, a lot of economists are coming out with work today that is basically, I have a truly marvelous regression result, but I can't show you the data, and I won't even show you the code that creates it. And that is kind of the current state of affairs, and it's led to a real sort of necessity of investigation and some policies that have been put in place recently by the American Economic Association and by many other economics journals about how this situation could be improved. So Lars Vilhuber, who has been connected to this organization and given talks, he is a Cornell researcher who's also associated with the Census Bureau, has just been named the data editor for the AEA and has a fairly well-developed plan in place for replication studies. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the economics community is recognizing that this is an issue that we need to worry about. That being said, there's been this proliferation of studies with private data. And so this particular graph that I found, which I'll also point out is not that great a graph, I'll talk about that in a second. But the whole concept of private data is leaving open that it could come from a variety of sources. So it's not just administrative records that are getting attention. It's data that you get from a company, you get it from Lyft or Uber, and then you have this exclusive right to use it. And you can see how the number of NBER working papers, so the National Bureau of Economic Research puts out these working papers on a regular basis, has kept track of the number that have been released over time. I kind of wish this was the proportion of papers that use private data, but it still gives you an idea, and similar graphs showing similar information show the same thing, that there's just been this huge increase over the last couple of decades in these in the proliferation of these papers. There are a lot of reasons for why this is happening. There's a great deal more computer power than there was a couple of decades ago. Administrative records can be absolutely enormous, and I'll get into a couple of the data sets that I use a little bit later. And so, quite simply, the computer power did not exist to use these data just, a couple of decades ago. Also, the ubiquity of computers for tracking just about every aspect of our life is a fairly new phenomenon. And so, when you have a point of sale system that is collecting cash register transactions, and you have a program like the SNAP program that's keeping track of all of its recipients in a computerized manner. Those are things that are fairly new. And so that is part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in. We also have a much stronger focus on the use of data for policy evaluation. And this is actually a cross-disciplinary, so I don't know how many folks in the room are economists or studying a similar topic, but if you're interested in policy analysis, if you are an administrator of any sort, you know that a lot of programs are having their evaluation guidelines built into the programs themselves, and that they are collecting data with the idea of evaluation down the road. And so the focus on policy evaluation and using administrative records for that purpose is also something that is relatively new. And so increasing numbers of agreements are being built between entities in order to create this environment of policy analysis. So the Census Bureau gets data from other agencies talk to each other, states build a compendium of data sets in order to look across programs. And so the systems of data that are being built are sort of a development of this focus. The next issue is a growing recognition of the impact of non-classical measurement error. One of the things that we do a lot of at the Census Bureau is we ask people questions. So we go out and we administer the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey. And more often, respondents are turning us down completely. They're giving incomplete information, so item non-response, or in kind of the worst case scenario, I think they tell us information that is not true. And that's becoming more and more of an issue that's recognized in the community of survey scientists. And there's a whole cottage industry of measurement error studies. If these non-response issues were random, we wouldn't really need to worry about it. But unfortunately, they're associated with a lot of the economic questions that we want to study. And so administrative records, if you can get the same information without asking people for it, is very attractive. There are a lot of issues with that, which maybe I'll talk about a little bit more as I go through the talk. But ultimately, that is one of the driving forces in using administrative records more and more often in these studies. Finally, there's this big appeal of big data for capturing a lot of people. So surveys are extremely restrictive. You can only look at the people who are in the sample. Whereas if you use something like all of the 1040 data that has been produced throughout the entire 90s and 2000s and 2010, it's a huge number of people, and it's basically close to a population of tax filers. And so if you then can connect them to their demographic data, you can cut that data in many different ways, look at different groups that you wouldn't be able to capture. One of the issues that we faced in social sciences is the fact that very small populations such as American Indian, Alaska Native are very hard to capture information on in surveys. You can't do a lot of economic analyses on that group because it's, the number of people that you have just isn't large enough. And so big data can get you a lot more people. Now that I've used the term big data, which is, I think, a big catchphrase these days, I will go through the definition of my specific meaning of administrative data in terms of the things that I know and am trying to impart. So I like this taxonomy that I came across from Connolly in Social Science Research in 2016. We can make the distinction between made data and found data, first of all. So made data is you run an experiment, you get data from it. You give a survey, you get data from it. It's data that is generated for the purposes of research. And so you have a question, you try to get the data that will help you answer that question. In contrast, found data is data that has been produced for a different purpose. And specifically, the administrative data that I'm interested in talking about today are collected for a functional purpose, whether that be program evaluation later on down the line, keeping track of recipients of our program, or in the case of the tax administration, making sure that people are in compliance with the tax code. And so the fact that this is collected for a functional purpose means that there are some assumptions that you have to make in order to use them for research purposes. But there are a couple of benefits to administrative data defined in this manner compared to other types of big data. So while neither is generated for research purposes, the admin data gathered by an agency, you know that it's been gathered for some reason. And then you want to have a data set that provides a certain amount of statistical reliance, some properties that allow you to actually analyze it as though it's an apparent population, which is something that you can't really get from other forms of big data. So under some assumptions and some qualifications, we can consider 1040 data as all filers. Like we know that within a year, we get that data, it's 2016 or whatever, we know that all of those people filed their taxes. And again, there might be some administrative error, there might be some error in transmission, but hopefully those errors are random, and so they're not going to impact the final analysis of the data. The combined 1040 and W2 cover close to the population of workers. SNAP recipients in a given state, we know, are the ones in those states who form the recipient population. And so moving on to other types of big data, it's really hard to pinpoint what is my population? What is it that I'm interested in looking at? So for example, transaction data from a point of sale system, they're unlikely to capture every sale or purchase because they're usually from a given company or given system. And social media accounts, I don't even know, like, if you're looking at tweets, what are those? It's really hard to know of any kind of statistical properties that they might have. So I am kind of I don't want to say harping on this, but I want to make it clear what type of data that I'm talking about, because not only is it what census holds, and it's what I've worked with, but it also, my point of view regarding the different ways in which we can treat these data is going to be different from other ways in which to treat big data. I know people love to go out and scrape the web, so there's going to be more and more of this stuff coming out, and it causes not only problems with transparency and replicability, but also how can you say anything statistically about what you have? So that's a whole nother issue, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so what does the Census Bureau exactly have? And these are some administrative data that I've worked with, or that I know that the Census Bureau contains. This again is going to become relevant as I talk, because I'm going to tell you guys how you might be able to access it. So the first is we have a lot of what's called Title 26 data. We have tax records, 1040, the W-2, the 1099, and we have it for a number of decades for the 1040 data. Other government agency data that we hold is the Social Security Administration universe of Social Security numbers, and their associated date of birth for the people who receive a social. That's used in, I'll talk about the linking process that we use later, but that's used in our linking processes at Census. We have housing and urban development records on housing subsidy recipients. We have Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, a whole bunch of other government agency data. And then for state agencies, we hold a combined file called the LEHD, employment data from state unemployment insurance agencies. And then we have a lot of program data, WIC, TANF, SNAP. We also hold some proprietary data, things like CoreLogic and some other material. I'm not going to talk very much about those because, again, I think they fall under the big data banner and have a lot of other issues with them that I'm not really qualified to talk about. But we do use them in the linking process to try to capture as many people as we can. So that brings me to the linking process. There are a couple of ways you can use administrative records. You can use them in isolation, and many of the first projects that were put out that were in coordination with the IRS or Treasury, such as Chetty et al. In 2014, they actually contracted with the IRS. They went to the IRS. They went through all of the security checks and dealt with all of the bureaucracy to do that. But they were only able to access the 1040 data or the SSA earnings records in isolation. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to attach the children, the dependents in those data, to the parents, and were able to do that for that project. A more recent paper is Larimore and his co-authors. So they also are using the tax data in isolation to try to build families that are comparable to survey or census families. And those are very interesting in their own right. And they follow, so Larimore et al., I think, are all employees of either Treasury or IRS. Chetty was an outside researcher, so it might be more relevant to what you guys might think of as access. And then the best type of admin records to have are those that are linked to demographic data. So when Census Bureau receives an administrative record from another agency or from another state, the records come in with personally identifiable information of some kind, name, date of birth, social security number. And then those records are compared against a master reference file. And this is made up of the NUMIDENT, which I mentioned before, the SSA Social Security records, and a bunch of other administrative data. We place a unique identifier on that data, and all of the personal information is stripped. And then a researcher is able to link a person really at will in any data set that he or she is in. So if you answered the American Community Survey, we can get that identifier on you, and then we can link you to the 1040. We can link you back to the 2010 census. We can link you forward in time from the 2010 to later tax data, so on and so forth. So it's unique. It never changes over time. A big caveat with that, the data sets have to be approved for each use that they're put to. So there's a long approval process within census for within census researchers to use these data. And as I'll talk about in a moment, there are not only restrictions on which individuals get to access the data, but once you get to the data, what can you use it for? So there are restrictions from the agencies on the types of studies that can be done. So some examples of economic research on the linked data. We've been doing this for a long time, and I think it's the proliferation of these studies more recently that have made people kind of not realize that this work already kind of had a long history. So Bound and Kruger had a 1991 paper where they linked the current population survey to the SSA earnings records to examine this mismeasurement issue that I was talking about before, where there was this measurement problem in survey earnings that they uncovered. And like I say, it's led to a cottage industry in labor economics on the mismeasurement of earnings and wages, earnings and income. And then there's the paper with Chetty that I'll talk about, and I'll talk about it throughout the presentation. So this is Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, Sonia Porter, who is my supervisor at Census, and me. So we took the children born in 1978 to 1983, and we found them in their parents' 1040 filings. So we were able to look at their income in fairly recent years, 2014, 2015, and we could look at their parents' income around 1994, 1995, and so on. And we were able to capture 94% of children who were born in those cohorts using these combined data. So we're looking at people who are, I'm not sure how old everybody is. I mean, this age range was born after I was, but 30 some odd years old in the years where we look at them, somewhere between 32 and 37, and then back to when they were children. And we can look at where they grew up based on their parents' 1040 filings. So it uses demographic information from both decennial censuses and the entire combined American Community Survey. And this allowed for really an unprecedented project looking at intergenerational income mobility over a very long time period, which was not really able to be done before, and small race and ethnic groups. And so, I mean, that's pretty cool. It would be very cool if anybody could do that. I'll talk a little bit more about how the project came about in a little bit, but so that brings me to well, first of all, does anybody have any questions yet? I'm going to stop periodically and ask for questions because this is a long talk and it gives me a little bit of a break, and it also lets you ask questions that might have come up and not have to remember them till the end. So any questions from anyone right now? No? Okay.
Can we interrupt
Yep.
you?
Absolutely. Yeah, interrupt me, it will.
I had a question about that, but I forgot it now.
Oh, no, see, that's the problem. So what is the state of economics replication? Because that itself, I mean, just as a general thing, is not so great. It's something that I don't think has been really, there hasn't been a large focus on it in the economics field or in related disciplines, policy analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And currently, and I think a little bit on the recent side, an ability to replicate studies is often used basically as a coding lesson when you are in an econometrics or research methods class at the PhD level. So you grab a study that you like or that you don't like, and this depends on what motivates you, and get one that uses public data, or one where you can communicate with the person who wrote the study and say, can you send me your data, or whatever you might need to do. And then you attempt to replicate the analysis described in the data methods section of the paper. So you don't ask for their code. You kind of go through, and it's like a little detective story of your own to figure out exactly every step. And is what they described in the paper, does it really coordinate with the results that you get when you implement what they said that they did in the data section, and so on and so forth. So the goal of this is pretty pedagogical. It's, to teach you how to translate the steps in a data and methods section. And can you build a stated do file or an R file or whatever you use and do that type of replication. So this falls under statistical replication. If another researcher uses the same data, follows the same steps outlined either in a syntax code or in a data method section, will he or she get the same results? That has had a certain amount of attention in the economics literature, but I think economics is as interested in scientific replications as opposed to just statistical. So if I change the sample a little bit, do your results change? Are they really sensitive to making slightly different choices with the data? And so there has been some of that. Like I say, they're not, it's not a focus. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I think. I am putting down just a few examples where basically these were more scientific replications where, you combine some new data with the old data that was used in the study, you get different results. The replication of Hawkesby started off as a statistical replication, and then, the author made some slight changes that really changed the results of the paper quite a bit. And then he had a complaint that the data provided did not reflect the data that was actually used in the paper, which was really kind of a problem. And then the most recent one is this replication of Reinhardt and Rogoff, which made a big media splash because there was like a really, really dumb error in an Excel spreadsheet that they were basing a lot of their results of their paper on. So anyway, so that kind of gives a little bit of a rundown of what people are looking at in economics. But it was not a focus when I was in school myself. And I think a lot of junior economists who might be desiring redoing a study are so concerned about the tenure process and so concerned about publishing their own work. It's sort of like you don't necessarily, there isn't this impetus to go back and revisit what other people have done. I don't know how that is in other sciences, but in economics, it's definitely true that there's a certain amount of lack of focus on replication. Okay. So again, as I was building this presentation, I thought of some of the keys to replication that I think are necessary. To do a statistical replication, it seems like you really have to have data access. You have to have permission to use exactly the same analysis data set that the researcher used. Or you have to have the ability to download or otherwise obtain the data set or obtain additional data that the researcher used. So economists have a tendency to use a kitchen sink approach to their analyses. So you're looking at a particular feature of the US economy and you attach for every unit of observation by state in your data, the unemployment rate at that time. Where did you get that data? And not a lot of this is very well documented. So you have to be able to get exactly the same stuff that the researcher used. And then if you really want to do sort of a scientific replication, sort of what Lars described in a presentation he made yesterday at AEI, you have to have a team of people who are willing to get the syntax files, get the data, run it all, and see if the results are the same. And that's kind of the statistical replication that a lot of the journals are interested in having done to make sure that they're scientifically valid and that the papers are actually saying, the papers are actually reflecting what the code and the data are saying is basically the best way to put it. So for example, you run some code and it's supposed to build a particular table, and the table that you have is completely different because the person manipulated it in Excel or something like that. That's something that you want to know as part of a replication process. Okay, so here's where we get to the barriers to administrative data access, which is sort of rule one of a replication. And unfortunately, there are a lot of them. And it's worth it to go through them kind of carefully because if any of you in this room want to go out and apply to use certain data sets, I encourage you to do that. And I'm going to hopefully give you information that makes things look a little bit less Byzantine. So there are really three barriers to data access that have been identified. The first is what I'll call legal. So there is actually federal regulations that say you can use the data in such and such a way, and these people can use the data, but these people can't. There are agency rules, which are slightly different. They're just policies and to a certain extent legal interpretation of those same regulations. And because the agency really controls the data, even if your desired use of the data is within the regulatory framework, it's really up to the agency to decide whether they want their data used that way. And finally, there are really quite constricting resource constraints. The federal government is kind of classically underfunded, understaffed, and so there are a lot of issues around data access that require infrastructure and personnel, and I'll go into those as well. Okay, so, yeah. I have one up here too that I'm not using, so I don't know if.
Given these barriers that you describe, particularly on the legal side, is it possible to think that not even disclosing the code, not even disclosing the data, but when a paper is released, to disclose very clear instructions on how to pass those legal barriers and costs, maybe something like that? Kind of leaving a paper trail to say that you follow A, B, C, and D, and you will get this data.
Yeah, I think it is probably possible to do that for many of the data that we hold. Okay. And that's actually a really good idea because for a data set such as the LEHD, there is a proposal process to use it. And I'll go into that in a second. But if as part of like the disclosure notice in a paper, it says, go to this website to find out how to apply to use the data. I think that would be actually extremely helpful. Sometimes the provenance of the data is pretty opaque. Like, where do you go to get it? And it's probably, I think, one of the things that people are thinking about more and more often is having a way to cite data as opposed to just cite papers or whatever. But for data to have a given DOI code that makes it citable from project to project. Sometimes people use different names for data. And it would be nice to make sure that you're actually talking about the same thing. So the CPS ASEC and the CPS March supplement are sometimes used interchangeably. And for a new student coming out, or within a PhD program, they might not know that that's the case. So yeah, that's a good point. So legal barriers. There are usually statutory prohibitions on the use of administrative records, except for very narrow purposes. And the general motivation is to guarantee privacy and confidentiality of the data. When the data come from a particular program or from the 1040, from the IRS, there's a special concern that the data might be used for enforcement rather than just for statistical purposes. When data come into the Census Bureau, we never send it back out with any other information attached. So if the IRS sends us 1040 information and we link it up to survey data that might give household characteristics that say something about what they should have filed for taxes according to the CPS or what have you, we never send that data back out to them, the microdata. They don't get it back. An IRS researcher can come in and use the data, but the idea is that anytime there's a researcher using the data, we never see any of the personally identifiable information. That's completely blank to us. And so there's no way that an individual researcher could report for any type of enforcement. Hopefully that is extremely clear to everybody, to the taxpayer, to the members of the public who are following things like the citizenship question and the work that the census is doing on citizenship issues. And that's really about protecting the citizens' faith in government data systems. We don't want anybody to ever think that the data are being used in a way that is not in service to the citizenry, is the best way to put it. That being said, often these regulations have not kept pace with technology. So the regulations are very concerned about, for instance, it took us a long time to be able to access 1040 data remotely. So we had remote access to our servers for telework purposes for years before the IRS allowed the people who use the IRS data to work remotely. So we had to put a lot more protections in place, and all of us complained at the time, I want to work from home, and why can't I do that? But sometimes these agencies are a little bit slower than others to get up to speed on the technology and to have faith in it. And as I mentioned before, the usage of these data are permitted for statistical purposes only. And so, for example, that requirement kind of circumscribes what we can do with some of the variables. There are certain 1040 variables that we receive at Census that are only to be used for tax administration studies. So if I wanted to look at a labor market question, or I wanted to look at, does this particular tax law cause people to get married? Or something like that. Something that a lot of social scientists might be interested in asking. You can't use the data for that. That's you can only use it if you are saying something about tax filing. So, and so even within these regulations will constrain some of the projects that can be performed. Prohibitions occasionally also exist on the collection and storage of data. So for example, we get data from the National Student Clearinghouse, but there is a requirement in the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act that prohibits the establishment of a permanent database of student records. So we can't do that. So there are other ways that we can study those data, but we can't keep them all together in one spot. So these regulations definitely make a difference in how you interact with the data. State laws regarding data use can vary really widely, even for programs that are federally funded and are administered through the states. It's just the way it is. So the next barrier to access is the policy and legal interpretations that states might make of regulations that that might not have clear guidance. In the absence of clear guidance, they often just say no. you can't have our data, or you can't use our data for this particular study. There's a lot of fear there. There's a lot of concern, as I said before, among people who administer programs, that if the data are somehow used for enforcement, that it might get them in trouble or it might get their constituents in trouble. And so there has definitely been a concern of people who are kind of on the ground at the state level, that the data use is not going to be in line with what they expect. And so there's inconsistency in access that contributes to complications in data collection, and also permissions for other people to use the data. And a good example of this is the Census Bureau going directly to the USDA to get the agreement in place that it was okay for states to share their SNAP data with us. And so that was an extra step that we had to take even while we were negotiating with individual states because of this concern. The other thing is that because our holding of state data is covered with agreements with individual states, we occasionally have to go state by state to get approval for a project. So say you wanted to replicate a study using the LEHD, you can go through the Census Bureau to propose it, and then the Census Bureau will need to get the permission from every state that was used in that study in order to replicate the study. So you can see where there could be a bit of a barrier there. Okay. Other barriers that we face are the storage and curation of data sets. So the Chetty et al. Paper that I mentioned before, the big project with intergenerational mobility, the data bank that was used in the main analysis, it might even have been bigger than this, but it is at least 400 million observations, which is a lot. It's a lot of data. Admin records are also not generated for research purposes, as I mentioned before, and so they require a bunch of steps in order to be able to use them for research purposes. They need to be cleaned. We often get data from agencies with no usable documentation or metadata, and so that has to be built, and it often falls through the cracks. And so say you want to replicate a study, and somebody used the data and they had some kind of inside knowledge that they didn't document. If you get access to the data and you try to duplicate what they did, it might be very difficult because the documentation was poorly contained or poorly set up. Did you have a question?
Yes, yeah, another question, sorry. I recently saw a presentation by a researcher, the name, I think it's Shirley Wang, I think it's biostatistician from Harvard. Uh-huh. She's doing an exercise of computational reproducibility on biomedical data. Mm-hmm. And basically, they start from the assumption, or they were not surprised to find that they, even with the same method, same code, they will not achieve the same results because these data sets, administrative records, claim records, yeah, they are updated or refreshed continuously.
Yeah, that's a problem.
So it's question A: does that happen in this context? B: is it possible to store a set of kind of the data that was used for X paper and just store it somewhere?
Yeah, fortunately. We do get some data. For example, the 1040 data actually come in on it's refreshed continuously by the week of filing. And essentially, anybody who uses the data knows that they're going to use the final file, like the final yearly file that's gotten the last distribution of 1040s. And so that is definitely an issue. And I'll get to this in a minute, hopefully, but I'll say it again. I might as well say it again. Never, ever, ever overwrite your raw data, right? Like if you are doing a study and you have a vintage of data, just don't do anything to it. You've always got to be able to get from the starting point to the end. And so if there's an administrative record data set that is continually refreshed, you have to take the sample that you used and preserve it somehow, definitely. Okay, so all of these things mean that the infrastructure to protect data and control access is already pretty onerous. And it includes both the data use policies and the technology to enforce access. There are lots of processes in place at the Census Bureau, including some pretty heavy-duty disclosure avoidance reviews, the necessity of adding noise to official statistics that are put out, or putting out data that have very specific disclosure avoidance through cell suppression and things like this. And there's a long history of that at the Census Bureau. Okay, so it might help to go through, like, what are the implications if you wanted to replicate a paper of mine? Yep.
There's just a question about these constraints.
Yep.
In the example where, say, a researcher's sending you PII and then you're sending it back with a unique identifier, all the PII stripped.
Yeah.
Are there...
So the researchers come to, just to be clear, the researchers come to us?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that case,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
which I imagine many of us may be interested in, with
Yeah.
pairing it with experimental data or something. Is there clear guidance on the type of, like, informed consent that you're looking for from participants about, like, what data we're going to be getting, even if it is de-identified, and, like, how to use it? Is there a place that we can go to, like, make sure that we're fully informing participants ahead of time?
Right.
Or does it kind of vary based on what data you're using?
It kind of varies based on what data we're using. So the American Community Survey is actually a required survey, a mandatory survey, they call it. Not really required. This is not my area of expertise, but I'll be as clear as I can. So to give you an example, the current population survey, which I use a lot, actually has either, depending on which year of data you're using, it has an informed consent to match the data to other data, or an implied opt-out. So, yeah, they could be better, I think. I think both could be better. But for example, there are limitations on, so the current population survey annual social and economic supplement is owned by the Census Bureau. That's the survey that we give to people who are in the current population survey sample. The current population survey monthly data is actually owned by the BLS, and it has a different opt-out system, and so we don't link that. We don't link those data, even though they're in-house.
Okay, and that's on your end, but I guess, right, like, but I guess from our end, like, if we are enrolled, say we have human subjects,
right,
and we're getting their consent to participate in the research, and as part of the research is we want to try and access your de-identified data. It feels opaque to me sometimes in terms of going to you, and I don't know if there's what you guys or other administrative agencies would be looking for before granting us access to this.
Right.
If there's any concern for that, or if there's, like, any resources we could use to learn more about that.
I think that's a good question, and I'm not an expert on that, but it's if we want to talk afterwards, I can maybe point you in the right direction. One of the things that I don't do and that I don't know very much about is writing the agreements that these data come in under. I've helped write them, the agreements, but the people who do the negotiation are in a different part of Census. So, but they might very well have guidance, and I just don't know where it would be found. So anyway, so just to give kind of a case study, there's a paper of mine, National Tax Journal. I wrote it with Amy O'Hara. Amy O'Hara and I were the two people who had access to the data ever. So there are some technical people at Census who have access to either data set. But the data that we put together and put in the project space that we linked together, she and I had access to that data. It uses, I'll read the abstract. So this paper examines a method of tax avoidance not previously studied, the sorting of dependent children among related filers who have doubled up in a household for economic reasons. Using the current population survey annual social and economic supplement linked with 1040 data, and I should also point out the EITC recipient file, which is a separate file from the IRS. We examine households with children and at least 2 adult tax filers to determine whether the household minimizes income tax burden and maximizes refunds by optimally claiming dependents. Okay, so it used survey data, matched it to the 1040 W-2. I got the list of people who received the earned income tax credit in the years that we looked at. And in a huge simulation exercise, we examined every possible combination of dependent filing for households that had like mom and grandma, like who gets the kids, right? To see whether they optimally claim dependents to get more EITC dollars. That's the whole point of the paper. The answer is they did, which you don't need to know about. But anyway, so who might want to replicate this paper? It's very complicated. It has this huge simulation exercise, which involved my having to run a SAS program through Stata, which was exciting. And right now, I and one special sworn status researcher named Jim Ziliak are the only 2 people now with access to these data. The EITC recipient file files under a regulatory banner that prohibits its use except for, like I said, tax administration research. And there's no process in place for other interested researchers to request this file. Literally none. So there are data sets that I've been describing at Census, mostly related to Title 26, the 1040 data, the W-2 data, that right now we do not have a proposal process in place for people to request it. And my next big question to all of you, is there any hope? Is there anything that you guys can do to check whether or not the paper that I wrote with Amy was bogus or good or, had massive codes and extremely complicated, lengthy do files? Who knows? Okay, so here's what I thought of as the best solutions from the worst case where you have no access to the data at all to the best case. The first is I could provide you with my code. There's no reason why I can't do that. And that goes along with the new AER replicability study guidelines and the stuff that Lars is doing. So the worst case scenario is you get my files and you read them through and you're like, this is ridiculous or whatever. The next best solution, which wouldn't apply here, but might apply if you wanted to look at the Opportunity Atlas, which was the data set that we created for the Chetty project. And that is access to data that are at the tract level and have been noise infused. I'll describe those in a little bit. And finally, you could look at code submission to someone with access to the, quote, real data. So if Jim Ziliak wanted to take code that I wrote and run it and then report back to you, that's a way that we could get around this. And actually, that's what some statistical agencies in other countries do. So a researcher works with the data, comes up with a project, reports the results, has the files available for checking, and then somebody at the statistical agency will run their code for them. And there's a certain amount of checking process that goes on at the same time and a quality control. That gets back into the resource constraints because, quite frankly, the Census Bureau at this time would not have the resources available to run replication exercises on request, essentially.
So I was thinking about, you just mentioned other, like national statistical offices in other countries use some sort of like peer review, peer replication process or something. But I think the problem with that is the potential for bias within that.
Oh yeah.
You know, like your colleague looking at your work, they might be more or less motivated to pick it apart or be critical. And so I think that like while we're dreaming, maybe and since we don't have funding for the census to do any of this, maybe we should think a little bit beyond that and think about like institution level review processes by third parties, or I don't know what it would look like, but something that gets away from that bias.
Yeah, one thing that I think is being talked about, and I'm not involved in any of these discussions and have only heard about them secondhand, is having code review be part of the disclosure avoidance process and part of the overall review process before papers are put out. So papers at Census go through a statistical review where somebody will read the paper and say, you mentioned that this percentage was lower than this other percentage. Did you actually statistically test that so that you can say that it's truly lower or higher? And so as part of that review process, we could have internal code review, which might take the, unless you have particularly mean colleagues, might take that problem out of the equation. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
Okay. So I wanted to show what I think is a really pretty good provision of syntax files along with how come this will not let me click on it?
Open it in the browser.
Open it in the browser. Okay. Oh, is it already up there? Yeah, that's right. We did that, didn't we? Okay. So here's the review of economics and statistics. And this is part of the Harvard Dataverse. And you can see the documentation for the paper. You can see some of the supplementary data that this person used and the do files that did all of the analysis. There's a README, which is nice. And then somewhere in here, and I think it's in the README file, there's instructions on how to actually ask for the data. So that it says, how do you go about proposing it, which is what you were talking about. So that's nice. Like I came across that and I thought that's a good way of doing things. So that's the kind of thing, even if you can't provide the data itself, that would be extremely helpful and move things forward quite a bit. I mean, really, when you think about it, data should behave reasonably well. And so if you see that somebody is manipulating a variable in a way that just doesn't pass the straight face test for any data that you know, it probably doesn't for the data that you can't get access to. Anyway, so this is a do file that I downloaded from the Dataverse that I just showed you. What I want to point out is the fact that throughout this do file, there are variables listed and there are file locations. So here's the file location, and here are some variable names. The problem that I face in following up on this sort of thing is that it's not only the data that are protected at the Census Bureau, it's the metadata. So, and it's the drive locations. All of the drive locations are not reportable, and a lot of the variable names that are provided to us from the agencies that send us our data can't be sent out publicly. So that's a little bit of a problem. But it actually is kind of a nice problem, because one thing that I really, really dislike is when the drive name in my do file is repeated over and over and over again. So when a co-author of mine sends me a do file and it's got the drive everywhere, like it has any long string anywhere, I turn it into a macro and change it everywhere. And this is good because you'll always know that you're saving things where you really mean to save them. You don't have any typos in your drive name, so on and so forth. You know, it's better to have the code be clean. So I can easily redact the drive name. That's gone. And from then on out, I'm only referring to it via the macro, so it's gone for the whole file. And then if I really need to, if I need to rename all of the variables, I can redact the name of the original variable and just say I'm renaming it this thing. And then you'll always know it's that thing and describe what it is. Like, there are easy ways around this. So that brings me to, again, the best practices on writing these syntax files. Never overwrite the data. The whole idea behind the do files or the R files or SAS files, somebody takes your data from its raw state and outputs your paper. And you can set permissions on your data file just to be on the safe side. So you just can't overwrite it physically, just to make sure. More annotation means more transparency and also fewer headaches. I don't know how many times I've gone back to a do file as a new researcher and basically asked myself, what the heck did I mean to do here? I don't understand what this code does. So writing even notes to yourself, and especially to your co-authors, is really important, or to anybody who might want to replicate what you're doing, or even just for transparency, for somebody to be able to see immediately what the point of your code is and what your definitional statements are. I think it's also especially good to, if you're putting these in a repository, to employ README files and also outer scripts, so a master do file that runs everything in order, which means that you also want to alpha number your files, start them with a 0, 1, or with an A, or whatever, however you want to categorize them, so that you know how they run in order, and anybody can tell how they run in order. That's another issue that I faced as a new researcher, was getting this mass of files that referred to one another, but I didn't know what order they went in. So, and you probably have all heard this already during this event, but it's worth it to, reiterate it. Enclose repetitive information in macros, and this is a Stata-specific thing. I've heard Stata, you had a Stata class here, and obviously there are Stata users in the room. Stata doesn't make the use of temp files all that clear. SAS does it automatically. I'm not exactly sure how R works. I don't use R. But learning how to use temporary data files in Stata is a really good skill to have, so that you're not constantly overwriting these intermediate files. Because you never know when you're going to call one, and it's an old version, and it doesn't have what you expected. Okay. So in the social sciences, the current practice is you put the code on a faculty webpage or your personal page, and then you go from Stanford to Harvard and it disappears. So it's not stable or updated, and it's prone to disappearing. And it's also very difficult to find these things in web searches. Sometimes I've been really intrigued by an author's work, and I go to find the exact same data and look and look and look and look, and then I find that there's like a time machine version of the person's webpage, and there's the data. But anyway, and so it's really a good idea to look for a repository. So Repac has a really nice repository for supplementary files. There is some code hosted on NBER, but I don't think they have a place for individual researchers to post their code necessarily. It's more public service code, like how do you get all of the variable names into the CPSA sec. And then I swapped some of the initials here. It's ICPSR, has some repository stuff. And then Harvard Dataverse, which I showed before. But I think I wrote this before I realized there was a GitHub part of the training here. But I really do think that GitHub is a really excellent resource, and I plan to use it now that I know more about it. And I think some of these other computer science options are really good for storing code. Okay. So the next best option is you have, and this is more for scientific replication, you have a study, you can't get the administrative records, but you can get some kind of confirmatory external data, or you can get some aggregate data or synthetic data. And basically confirm that results are in use with public use versions of the same data. Really, this should be done by the researcher as part of validity tests. And I am personally doing more and more of these in my own work. And it could be employed as part of a replication exercise or a check of syntax. I think you kind of need to have the syntax code in hand. This is sort of like an additional good thing. So as an example, the IRS puts out the statistic of income public use files. This is a stratified random sample of all tax returns. By stratified, I mean it's stratified by different filing characteristics and also by income. So you can get some of the tails of the income distribution. And it can be used to benchmark income distributions against reports from the microdata or the combined data. Another example is program code that can be deployed on confidential use microdata, can also be deployed on the public use data. So here's an example where Jim Ziliak and I are interested in talking about estimates of the EITC in survey data versus some tax simulators compared to the EITC recipient file. And one question you might have is, you've got the statistics of income report of how many people get the EITC every year. How does the internal file compare? Like, are you really getting everybody in this internal file? And so this was a robustness check that we made as part of our paper. And you can see that the internal recipient file does a really good job of capturing everybody. And here's where I can bring out the pointer. So we found 100% of recipients, so that's nice. And we found 97% of benefit dollars. So there was a capture of that information between the recipient file in-house and the public reports, which was a nice confirmatory exercise. What was interesting is that we found that the number of recipients with no children, we found more of them. And so that actually led us to some extra analyses of the data. So it was a good thing to do. Okay. Another example is, this is from the Chetty 2014 paper that I mentioned earlier, where they had access to the earnings reports from within the IRS, and they benchmarked it against vital statistics to see how many people they actually had, like compared to who was born in the years that they wanted to look at. And the idea, again, is the idea of an apparent population, like how close to the population are you really getting when you're using these data? And so that, again, is a really nice exercise. And so these validation exercises could be done by an outside person. You just take the information from the paper and check it against published reports. And if there's something really wonky, you know, that you have something to say about that. Then there's access to synthetic data. I didn't believe this when I started the talk, but I think I might actually be close. I'm at 1:05. Did you want me to stop at 1:15 or 1:30? I mean, time. You have till, okay. Perfect. All right, good. I won't skip anything then. So the Census Bureau has really led the way in creating these data products. They are a little bit more complicated than I can get into the weeds here. But essentially, the loads and on the map is a bunch of data from the unemployment insurance system, which we also capture in what's called the LEHD, Office of Personnel Management Records, and the quarterly census for employment and wages, which is actually a survey-based data set from businesses who just kind of report how many people are employed and how much total earnings they pay out. And so these data are hosted as a web-based mapping interface, and then you can also download some flat files. What they did was they noise infused the data to protect privacy. And they did it in such a way that the published data were more accurate as the number of businesses per given area increased. So these data are reported based on sort of like where you live and then where you work, and there's information on both places. And so it's just a bunch of CSV files at the census block level that you can take off. And as you get more businesses or more people at the block level, the data get better and better. And then the ones that have few observations have more noise. And that's been around for quite a while. The synthetic SIP, I think, is a little bit more recent. So that's respondents of the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which, if you don't know this data, it's really cool. I've actually never used it, but every time I go to a talk that uses a SIP, I'm like, that's really cool. I should really look at that data. But in this case, it's the SIP that where people have been linked to their SSA, IRS earnings, and some retirement and disability records that we also get from pretty much the same sources. And then the synthetic data models all the variables in a way that changes the records of the individuals in the data, but it retains the covariate relationships among the different things that an economist might want to look at, like, family size versus income or whatever. So you can there's a system currently at Census where you run your code on the synthetic data, see what you get, and if it looks cool, you submit the code to the Census Bureau and they run it on the real data and send the results. So this is kind of the French version, like I was talking before. Yeah.
This is very cool.
Yeah.
This is this is like very aligned with reproducibility.
Yeah.
Because you think through everything before you know the results, and someone else, like, you have to make your code work. I assume they're not going to tinker with your code for you. They're not going to p-hack for you.
They're not going to p-hack for you. No.
So, like, who does this at the census? Is it, there's like a person whose job it is?
No, there's a team of people.
Yeah.
So the synthetic SIP is actually one of the better, like, if you even Google it, you'll get a lot of information.
Okay.
So I've seen some back and forth in seminars within the Census Bureau talking about the use of the data, and I'm hoping, because I don't know firsthand, and I haven't talked to anybody who has used this process, but they really, they're very proud of this product for good and sufficient reason. I don't know how well the exchange works. I personally don't know. And it could be great. It could not be great. I have no idea, unfortunately. But I'm sure that you could find out everything you needed to know if you just search the term.
Cool.
But yeah, the data are very cool. I will say, there's been a little bit of pushback on them, which I'll get to in just a second.
But following up on that basically this initiative that you're describing, plus some of the lessons that you have talked already so far, that it really feels like either there should be or there is, and I don't know, a paper or a book that's just like lessons from the census on how to share administrative data. Because now, and the bigger point that I'm thinking here is that the issues that you're describing are extremely recurrent in other countries.
Yeah.
Basically, this happens in Chile, in Argentina, in Finland, in Norway. It's everywhere, and people are addressing it in different ways.
Yeah.
And I know that the Nordic countries are doing some good stuff around it, but I don't know how to read it in a systematic way. And it would be great if there's something like.
Yeah. Well, I will say this. In a few more slides, I'm going to talk about the FSRDCs, and that will make people a little bit happier, because there are ways to apply for these data, which I'll talk about. Unfortunately, I say that. Well, let's wait until we get to the slide, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. So the next data set that I can talk about, which I mentioned briefly before, is the Opportunity Atlas, which was developed for the paper that we wrote, and the second paper that came after it that was specifically about the Atlas. And so this is IRS 1040 tax records, the 2 decennials, most recent decennials, and then all available American Community Service data, survey data, Numident, some public use files. And we report on the income, mobility, and related statistics, like I mentioned before, similar to what are in the paper, but we actually put them out in a data set that can be downloaded. And this is a data set that shows the income, mobility, and related statistics reported for every census tract. And if we don't have the number of a given race group in a particular area. Like, I don't want to give an example, but if there are very few people of American Indian origin in a particular spot, then that gets suppressed. It'll just be shown as blank on the map, and by all points by certain points in the parent income distribution, so 25th percentile, 75th percentile, and we push these out into this massive atlas, and obviously, aggregated data is never going to make a researcher as happy as microdata, but people should be just jumping up and down and cheering about these data because they give researchers the availability to access information that has just never existed before. And I can imagine, just a ridiculous number of uses for these data that people could, ways in which that they could use it or even try to replicate some of the findings in the Chetty et al. Paper. So just a little shout out for that. And I also wanted to point out that the way that we protect these data is through a noise infusion process that is not quite differentially private, but it's pretty darn close. And it actually produces better data than you would get if you use traditional cell suppression techniques. And so the white paper regarding the atlas is a really good read for anybody interested in that. And it also sort of sets, along with the synthetic SIP and the on the map, it kind of sets a growing process in terms of trying to make these data more accessible, the different data holdings that we have. There are objections to synthetic data. It's, first of all, impossible for the researchers to really fully specify the contents of the ideal synthetic data set in advance. You're kind of handed information that some other set of researchers thought you might be interested in, but it might not be what you wanted. It might not retain the covariate relationships that you were specifically interested in looking at. Also, there's been a move in economics to look at very important policy questions through a more state-of-the-art analysis that uses the entire distribution of outcomes of interest. So quantile regression, you're seeing more and more studies using that technique. And you really sort of need to be able to see the full distribution, which you don't get if you have synthetic data. So it's also sometimes difficult to study subpopulations unless the synthetic data were built around those subpopulations. And it also requires a very large infrastructure of intermediaries who will take your code and run it for you on the real data. And all of these objections were kind of outlined in this Card et al. 2011 paper. And his final comment is really sort of, painful. Researchers are always best served when starting from the raw data. And this is true. This is definitely true. But really, aggregate and synthetic data, it's better than nothing, right? And a lot of people have done really good research on these data. Okay, so now I get to the really fun part of telling you how to access administrative records through the Census Bureau. Since this is really the gold standard of being able to do reproducible research. So the Census Bureau right there on its website regarding the FSRDCs. So these are our research data centers that are all over the country. And most of the data, but not all of the data that I've talked about today, are available through the proposal process, through the FSRDC. I'll just read you this. The Census Bureau is committed to fostering reproducible science in the RDCs. That's from our chief scientist, John Abaud. And the data stewardship policy, which is the oldest policy on record, states that the research benefit to the Census Bureau is not fully realized until the complete peer-reviewed publication process, and that includes creating reproducible research. That being said, it was basically impossible for me to get information from anyone on how many projects are actually proposed to the FSRDC that in part or fully replicated other studies. I think most people, because the proposal process is fairly lengthy and it's work to create a proposal, they want to do their own research. They don't necessarily want to replicate other people's research. And so I think this is something that needs to be separately fostered if we want to go that route. And I think certainly John Aboud and Lars Vilhuber, who has worked very closely with him, are thinking about these things when they're thinking about improving transparency. So the available data that we have is listed here. If you these slides are going to be available, I assume.
Yeah, they're on the
So go on over here and see. Sometimes we are not great at telling you everything that we have, but this available data slide will talk about quite a lot of it. And then there's a separate one that I dug up, and it actually took me a while searching on. I don't often use the outward-facing website because we've got the internal website. But on the outward-facing website, it took me a while to find this, but this is the linkable data that we have. And so this is hosted by the people who are now running the FSRDC network. And so that little text file down here, or it's an Excel spreadsheet, lists all of the linkable data sets that we have. A caveat, it lists all of them. So not all of them are available, but there are some in there that you can request access for. And there are more being added all the time. So some of the barriers are falling. There could be a world someday when we have a proposal process for using the linked 1040 survey data. We don't have that process yet. Yep.
Do you have a sense of like how often requests for access are rejected? Like, do they provide stats or anything on like if is it really based on the quality of your idea and your ability to keep everything confidential, or is there sort of a capacity where like they're only going to grant so many requests?
I don't think there's a capacity constraint. It can slow down the process if they're getting a lot of requests. So here are some examples from the list, but I've talked about most of these today. So here's the proposal process listed out. So the project has to provide a benefit to Census Bureau programs. That can be really broad. If you have a feasible study and it says something, I think it says something about the people or the economics of the United States. Something like that, yeah, then you're good. So it's a pretty low bar to cross. It has to demonstrate scientific merit. It has to require non-public data. So I think a lot of the time projects are looked upon favorably if there's a particular measure in mind that you just can't get on the public use data. And it has to be feasible given the data that you're asking for and pose no risk of disclosure. And then for data, I mean, we hold a lot of data in the RDCs that you have to ask to use, such as the non-top coded current population survey or the non-swapped ACS data. There's some confidential use versions of the surveys that we hold separately. And so there's a proposal process for those as well. For any data that you are planning on linking, you have to go to the agencies then and ask for project approval through the RDCs. But the idea behind this, and it's outlined on the website, is that you start a proposal with your RDC administrator, and they will work with you through the entire process, and which helps a lot. I mean, the RDC network is really pretty amazing, and the services it provides to researchers at academic institutions. And there's probably one close to you. So, yeah.
I just realized there's one at Cornell, which is where I am.
Yes,
and
Sizer.
Yeah, it's all coming together.
Yeah, it's all coming together. Yeah. Yep. that's one of the best we have. Anyway, I used to go there too. So, all right. So, to conclude, statistical reproducibility of economic research that uses highly restricted administrative records is often unfeasible, but more and more admin data sets are becoming available every day. Scientific reproducibility of this economic research can be facilitated through the use of well-documented syntax files, comparing the results of a paper to public use information, and using aggregated or synthetic data. And I think researchers using administrative records should make it a practice to confirm their results just as part of the scientific process using these more public data sources. And then providing programming code should be part of the peer review process. Finally, the Census Bureau is continuing to work on making research more transparent through streamlined proposal processes. We're a lot faster than we used to be for proposals. And I think the RDCs are continuing to work on making the proposal process smoother and trying to make access more open. Okay, thank you. I'm just like half a second over.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah.
I want to ask just maybe, what is the mean time that between when I submit my proposal and when I actually get the data?
It really varies a lot.
But
It depends on what data you're asking for. So I think it's probably a few months to get a simple data set, like a simple data holding, as I mentioned before, the unswapped ACS or whatever. If you ask to use the LEHD data, it used to be that they would just go state to state and ask each state in turn, and so it could take a year and a half to get the data. When I was at Cornell doing my PhD, I wanted to do a particular project and talk to an advisor about it, and he said, you're going to be going on the job market in 2 years. Your proposal is going to take a year and a half. And so you're never going to be able to get the data in time to do what you have to do. But I think that's improved tremendously over the years. But I mean, some proposals do get hung up because you want data from a particular agency and they're just slow to respond. They have to send it to their lawyers. Their lawyers take a long time. It's true for internal projects as well. Sometimes it takes a really long time to get an internal project approved. So yeah, it's so variable. I don't really know whether I can give you an average. It might be something that is held by the RDC administrators, but yeah, I don't know where that information might be collected.